Hello, I'm Juliette Morris. Even the most unassuming and quiet corners of Britain can sometimes bear witness to the most dramatic events. In this week's Scenes of Crime, we visit a seaside town in Wales, where more than 40 years ago, a macabre discovery was made. A mummified body hidden for more than 20 years. But first, a cruel murder that brought a small country town in England some unwelcome attention. The little Buckinghamshire town of Fenny Stratford is one of the oldest in the county and was once a bustling place. These days it's been largely swallowed up by neighbouring Milton Keynes. But its unassuming facade hides a darker past, the brutal killing of an elderly man by a 16-year-old boy, an event which was to link this insignificant town with a world-famous film. It was a crime that became known as the Clockwork Orange murder.
We received a call on the radio, it's quite late in the evening, of a serious assault at Fenny Stratford at Fortescue's garage. So we made our way to the garage and were met by a uniformed constable and an ambulance. And they informed us that this tramp had been assaulted. We went to the ambulance and a doctor was already in attendance. And we were informed by the doctor that this chap was dead. We had a quick look at him and it was evident that his injuries, his facial injuries, were absolutely horrific. His face was just a mask of blood. And so we then put the wheels in motion to call out senior officers to start what we then knew was going to be a murder investigation.
Retired policeman turned author Leonard Woodley has written extensively on the subject.
Murder in the 1970s was still a relatively rare occurrence, and the impact of a murder occurring within a small community of Fenny Stratford and Bletchley was really quite terrible. People, of course, were talking about it for a long time afterwards, for years afterwards in fact, and it made headlines in the local newspapers and the national newspapers, of course.
The tragic story begins here at the Swan Hotel, an old coaching inn, which stands on the old Roman roads that stretch from Dover to North Wales.
This is the hotel bar, and on the night of the 4th of April 1973, David McManus, a vagrant, came in here for a drink. He was a vagrant. He'd had many previous convictions for drunkenness and vagrancy over the years, and in fact, the previous night he'd been arrested for drunkenness nearby and had appeared at court that very morning, been fined and released.
In the evening, he turned up at the Swan, just a stone's throw from the courthouse.
McManus had 20 pence in his pocket, 15 pence of which he paid for a pint of beer. He settled down by the open fireplace for the rest of the evening. There were several other customers in the pub that night. Among them were a group of friends, one of whom was a 16-year-old lad, whom, for the sake of argument, we'll call Huntley.
Huntley wasn't his real name. We'd given him a pseudonym because at the time of these events, he was a minor, only 16.
During the course of the evening, McManus's behaviour became more objectionable. He cadged cigarettes and beer from the various customers. So badly was he behaved that eventually the landlord decided to eject him. Shortly afterwards, Huntley left the premises as well.
McManus crossed the main road and headed for the fish and chip shop, where he spent his remaining 5 pence on food.
After buying his pasty and chips at the fish and chip restaurant, McManus walked round the few yards to the porchway of St Martin's Church, where he proceeded to eat them.
Shortly afterwards, the fish and chip shop closed, and the assistant went round to the back of the premises to collect his bicycle.
As he walked his cycle up to the main road, he saw a young man walk down the alleyway between the church and the fish and chip restaurant. The young man then jumped over the wall back into the church, walked back to the porchway and appeared to be talking to someone in the porchway itself. He saw that the young man appeared to be holding something. He next saw him walk up to the church wall, adopt a crouching position as though he was waiting for someone to emerge from the church porchway.
Several other people later reported seeing or hearing suspicious goings-on.
One of the other witnesses that night was a Mr. Dunnett, the proprietor of the Gents Outfitters here. He saw McManus staggering along the front of the shops towards Fortescue's garage.
As he stumbled along, McManus must have been in terrible pain from his injuries, but more was to come.
From his vantage point, Dunnett saw McManus stagger round into Fortescue's garage behind the petrol pumps, which would have been situated just about here.
What he saw next terrified him. The youth, who appeared to be holding something in his hand, ran into the garage after the tramp and followed him behind the petrol pump. Dunnett saw him crouch down, then suddenly straighten up and run off. By this time he was so suspicious that he phoned the police. Tony Walton, the former police officer, was one of the first people on the scene. He was horrified by what he found there, and immediately the search was on to find the perpetrator of such appalling violence.
There was a massive pool of blood next to the petrol pumps, and we actually then spread out the inquiries from there. Some officers went towards the church, found a church doorway with a pie and chips still wrapped in its paper, lots of broken glass and broken lumps of concrete, and then the inquiry spread out from there to the Swan Hotel. We spoke to the landlord, Mr. Regan, who was very helpful and basically started to build up the names of a number of people who were in the bar that night where the tramp was.
One of the people who appeared on the list of those to be questioned was the young man Huntley.
I think it was 2 days later that we actually traced him to a building site in Bletchley, a school that was just being built. And I went with another officer there, and we met the young man in the boiler house where he was working. We started to talk to him about his night in the Swan Hotel. When it became apparent, just looking down at his shoes and his trousers, that they were quite deeply bloodstained. I just asked him where he got the blood from, and he said, I was in a fight with the old tramp. And that was it. He actually admitted being involved in this murder. So he was arrested by my colleague and taken to Bletchley Police Station.
Gradually, the story of the vicious attack came out.
It would appear, from what we built up, that he'd been hit with several milk bottles, which had broken and smashed, lumps of concrete from a broken paving slab, which had really done a massive amount of damage to his face. But the old man had then staggered out of the church doorway, and the suspect had then run off. He walked past the fish shop, as we'd earlier heard from the customers in the fish shop, and when he got to the garage, the lad saw him walking, picked up 2 house bricks, and then attacked him again on the garage forecourt, rather viciously, knocking him down and eventually killing him.
The killing inspired a fascinating line of questioning when the youngster appeared in court. He was asked if he'd seen a certain film. A Clockwork Orange was first shown in 1971 and attracted criticism for its graphic portrayal of violence, at the same time as acquiring a certain cult status in some circles. In court, Huntley said,
"A friend was talking about it the other night. He saw the film. I didn't. It was about beating up an old boy like this one."
Asked what film he was talking about, he said,
"Clockwork Orange."
There is a scene in the film where a number of youths beat up a person, and it's done to some classical music, and it's supposed to be a very poignant scene in the film. It's absolutely horrific.
Huntley himself was too young to see the film, although with the friends that he mixed with had seen the film and they talked about it, and one particular aspect of the film itself was the theme tune, which they continually whistled, I understand.
But the question of Huntley's motive was never put before a jury.
Well, the suspect was charged with the murder of David McManus, and sometime later he was formally arraigned at Fenny Stratford Magistrates Court to the Crown Court. He pleaded guilty to murder, which is very unusual, and so there was no trial. He was then detained by the judge during Her Majesty's pleasure, which is basically the maximum term that can be given for a murder committed by a juvenile offender, as he was at the time.
In 1973, the film was withdrawn from circulation in the UK at director Stanley Kubrick's request. It was re-released after his death in 1999. Over a quarter of a century after that terrible night in this small town, the debate about screen violence is continuing.
As far as I'm concerned, the jury's still out. I think that if somebody's going to commit crime and somebody's got that streak in them, they'll commit the crime. I don't think, personally, that they can be influenced by what they see on the screen. It may give them an indication of how to get away with it. I don't know. But I don't really honestly think, as a 30-year police officer, that somebody, a normal person watching that film, would go out and commit a crime. I don't think so.
Perhaps the one certainty about the events of the 4th of April 1973 is the lasting legacy on the town of Fenny Stratford, which has never forgotten the Clockwork Orange murder. Fenny Stratford put well and truly on the map because of its links with a disturbing murder. Next, a disturbing discovery in Wales. A mummified body was found in a cupboard that had been locked for more than 20 years. Welcome back. I'm Juliette Morris. Now, mummies are generally found in places like Egypt or in museums, so how come one turned up in the cupboard of a boarding house in a Welsh seaside town? The small town of Rhyl on the North Wales coast was once a thriving holiday resort. But by the turn of the century, it had begun to decline, and today has the air of being decidedly down on its luck. But for a brief period in the 1960s, it became famous across the world when a bizarre secret that continues to fascinate and revolt came to light. Raymond Vaughan was a young PC in the area at the time.
The case was the most unusual case anybody, including the pathologist or the police, had ever encountered.
The story's set in this neat and pretty ordinary row of terraced houses just behind the railway station, West Kimmel Street. The scene of the crime is number 35. From the outside, there's nothing to distinguish it from any of the other three-bedroomed homes that surround it. But its unremarkable appearance masks an extraordinary past. For in the spring of 1960, a mummified body was found here. Tracy Jones is the current owner of the house and lives here with her two daughters, Callie and Narelle.
We bought the house 2 years ago, and my husband had said he thought it was a house with a mummy in the cupboard. And I was like, what mummy in the cupboard? Because obviously I'd never heard this story before. Anyway, he said that he did, or it's local story, that a woman was found mummified in a cupboard. And he knew it was in Kimmel Street. We didn't actually know what number in Kimmel Street. So this is when I actually went to the library and got the full story of the mummy in the cupboard. Before that, I knew nothing at all about it. When I'd gone to the library and actually found the story, I was quite shocked to realise it was the house that I'd bought. I didn't believe it would be this house.
Gradually, Tracy uncovered the story behind the strange death She found out that from the 1940s onwards, her home was run as a boarding house by a lady called Sarah Jane Harvey. In 1960, she went into hospital, and her son decided to decorate. What was planned as a surprise for his mother quickly became an unpleasant surprise for him. He opened a cupboard on the landing that had been kept locked throughout his childhood, and discovered the mummified body of an old lady.
As far as I'm concerned, this is where the cupboard was, where the lady was actually found in some past year. The cupboard wasn't here when I bought the house, so I presume they must have knocked it down after they found her.
But who was she, and how did she get there? PC Raymond Vaughan saw the body in the mortuary, but it gave him no clues.
I attended many post-mortems, but I'd never seen a body like this before. It looked to me like 2 slabs of concrete. There were no recognizable human features. There were no ears, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. There were no clothes on the body, and there were no hair on the body. It was the first mummified body I'd ever seen, and I shall remember it as long as I shall live.
The body's identity was a mystery. The only person who might have the answer was the boarding house owner, Sarah Jane Harvey. Suspicion inevitably fell on her. Her explanation was that the dead woman was an elderly lady called Mrs. Knight, who'd moved into the house in 1940. She wasn't well, and according to Mrs. Harvey, died suddenly one night. Not knowing what to do, she dragged the body along the corridor and put it in the cupboard, where it stayed for 20 years.
Foul play was suspected from the outset. The only thing that could give a positive direction, way in that direction, would be a thorough post-mortem, but it was quite impossible to carry that out. But Dr. Gerald Evans was of the opinion that something had been tightened around the neck of the torso, causing the death of the person. Consequently, the woman who was looking after this dead person in Rhyl was subsequently charged with murder.
The lack of conclusive evidence meant that Mrs. Harvey was found not guilty. She was, however, convicted of another crime, fraud, because for the 20 years that Mrs. Knight had been dead, Mrs. Harvey had been collecting her maintenance money.
I think the odd thing about this case was that the lady of the boarding house concealed the body in the cupboard for over 20 years solely for the purpose of drawing the maintenance due to the deceased, which amounted to a little over £2 a week, which was a lot of money in those days. She could have lived reasonably well on £2 a week in 1940. By the time the body was found in 1960, she would have accumulated somewhere in the region of £2,000, which would have been a windfall to many people.
Mrs. Harvey was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment for fraud. The crime made Rhyl a household name. People were fascinated by how the mummification could have occurred. It was a natural process. The doors of the cupboard allowed a free access of air, which gradually dried out the body.
I think the cupboard would have stopped here, but maybe it did actually go along, sort of perhaps to the top of the door there, and this is where the cooler air was coming through to actually mummify the body. But if you just look there, you would think it actually ended there, unless there was perhaps a vent at the top of it that, allowed the air to come in and out and obviously mummifying her. I think it's very unbelievable that somebody was actually mummified, because you think would have just gone to bones and wilted away in time, not actually mummified. But it's not, it was a little bit weird, a little bit scary to think of it.
When the horror story hit the headlines, sightseers flocked to the town.
At the time, when they actually found the mummified body, I suppose it made the house famous. And they used to bring day trips back and forth, people to say, this is the house with the mummified body in. But it's, I wouldn't want to go and see outside of a house where there's been a body mummified. But at the time, it was quite a big story, quite historical.
These days, Ryl's most notorious death is largely forgotten. But for Tracy Jones and her family at 35 West Kimmel Street, Mrs. Knight hasn't quite been laid to rest.
Well, at the moment, I'm standing in the cupboard where she would have been. And it is very strange, eerie feeling. Feel kind of cold, and to think this is where somebody was kept for 20 years, just left to rot away. It does feel really strange, really weird. I've lived here for 2 months. When I originally bought it, my brother moved in and his wife and rented for a year. Then my younger brother moved in after that and he rented for a year. My older brother moved out, as far as I'm aware of, because he found out about the mummy in the cupboard and he was scared.
My uncle actually told me that one night when he went to the toilet, he saw her and he did run back to his girlfriend and he was very white in the face. I didn't really believe the story at first. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but we have heard other noises in between the time. This is my mum and my sister's room. It was actually my uncle's and my auntie's. They moved out, they said it was too spooky. When he first moved in here, he was decorating this room and this wall. He put the scissors on top of the ladder when he turned away to put a piece of wallpaper up and the scissors started floating towards him. You sometimes hear her coming along the landing. She's quite heavy-footed. Things go missing around the house, and she sometimes likes playing with your hairdryer and electrical goods. I always thought if you die naturally, then you automatically don't become a ghost. But if you die, or if you're murdered, I think then they would come back to haunt you.
So an ordinary-looking house in an ordinary seaside town with an extraordinary story to tell. Join me next time when we visit more scenes of crime.